Hello. We're embarking on the third section of the book of Isaiah, one that I have called the character of servanthood. Through the book, the theme, I believe, is Israel as the servant of God to reach the nations. As we've said with all three of these segments, the book is a very complex one. It's a very complete one. In many ways, it's the most complete statement of biblical theology of any of the biblical books. But the theme, I believe, that is stated right at the outset, as early as chapter 2 is, the nations are going to come flooding to Jerusalem to learn God's Torah, to learn His instructions for life. And Israel's servanthood is to make that possible. So the struggle throughout the book has been the question of how can Israel indeed become that servant? I suggested when we were talking about chapters 40 to 55 that the means of Israel's servanthood is the servant who is climactically displayed to us in chapter 52, verse 13 to chapter 53, 12, often called the suffering servant, the one who gives his life in place of his people. In many ways, though, we could think that the book should have ended at chapter 55. You've got the beautiful invitation in chapters 54 and 55 to come and buy what you don't have money to buy, to eat what you don't have money to eat. Yes, come and be delivered from the sin that has dogged you all of your life. Come and receive God's grace. But the book doesn't end at chapter 55. Just as chapter 6 didn't end with Isaiah's lips being cleansed by the coal from off the altar that touched his lips. No, in many ways, that experience of salvation, experience of cleansing, was in order that now Isaiah could speak the Lord's message to his people. In the same way, I believe, the book of Isaiah is structured. Why does the servant make salvation available to his people? In order that they may declare the good news of God to the world. And that's really what chapters 56 to 66 are about. But these chapters are arranged in a very strange way. And as you saw in the introductory section in your book, I believe that the section is structured chiastically. That means that you have the two end elements saying much the same thing, then the next two elements saying much the same thing, and the next two saying much the same thing, until finally you reach the single climax point. I think that's what's going on here. The beginning and ending sections speak about righteous foreigners, God's goal for this whole process. But then the next two sections talk about Israel's sinfulness. They are in fact not light that would end in the world finding God. They are in fact darkness. What about that? Then in chapters 59 and 63, we have suddenly the revelation of a divine warrior who will come and defeat the enemy that is dogging his people. And we'll want to talk about who that enemy is. Then in chapters 60 and in 62, we have the light shining out of Israel to all the world, and all the world coming to Israel. What has happened to change sinful Israel into the light? And finally, the very climax of it all is chapter 61, verses 1 to 3. The Spirit of the Lord has anointed me to preach good news. The final climactic revelation of the servant, yes, and the warrior. So our study will be focused around this chiastic arrangement. We'll jump back and forth a bit, and that's what we're doing in this very first lesson. We begin with chapter 56 and also include chapter 66. And we see here the challenge to live righteous lives. Throughout this entire study, we'll be coming back to this again and again. What does salvation, what does deliverance from the bondage of our sin entail for us? Do we simply say, oh good, Jesus died for me, my sins are forgiven, and I'm just going to sit here and rot till I die, and then I'll go to heaven? No, throughout the Bible, the point is made again and again. We are saved from the guilt and the condemnation of our sin in the past in order that we might live the life of God. And so right at the outset in chapter 56, we've not talked about the need for living righteous lives. In chapters 40 to 55, we've talked about God's gracious salvation that is made available to people who will believe His promises. But now in 56:1, we'll be told, keep justice and do righteousness. Why? For my salvation is about to be revealed. Why? In order that the world might know. So there in chapter 56, verses 1 through 8, we have that picture. Again in chapter 66, in verses 18 through 24, we have the nations coming to God. But then we see so suddenly, reminiscent of chapters 1 to 6, we see so suddenly the picture of sinful Israel. Israel whose leaders, and again this reminds us of chapters 28, 29, 30, whose leaders are failing them, whose leaders are not leading them into righteous lives, but in a sense are confirming their unrighteousness. What has happened? I think it's this. The people have returned from captivity, and they are thinking, well, why are we back? Are we back because we repented and lived righteous lives back there in Babylon? No, we're back simply by the grace of God. So it doesn't matter how we live now. We're God's chosen people. That's not just an ancient problem. It can be a problem for modern Christians. Well, I'm saved by grace. I'm saved because of my relationship to Jesus through faith. So it really doesn't matter how I live. Oh, yes, I'll try to live a little more like Christ, but if I can't, and I can't, then it doesn't matter. These chapters say to us, yes, it does matter. If the world is to be won to Christ, it will only be done so because it has seen the reality of Christ in the lives of Christ's followers.